Hello everyone and welcome to another Shaman video for the Shadowlands beta and for the PTR. Today we're going to be discussing the new changes that happened recently on the beta and the PTR. We're going to be going over all the stuff that is affecting Elemental Shamans specifically because that's what Blizzard has targeted most as well. I just want to say before we get started into the deep dive for these changes, all of the information that we talk about is going to be referred to from the Wowhead articles discussing the build. If you want to check them out for yourself, the links to those will be in the description down below, along with the blue posts that we quote as well. Also, if you want to follow me on my social medias, Twitch and Twitter, the links to those will be in the description down below, so you guys can go and check that out at your own accord. Give me a follow on there or drop by the stream whenever you want. I pretty much stream every day after 4 p.m. Eastern. Sometimes I go on a little bit earlier as well. Just forget those EU fellows over there. All right, let's talk about the changes because overall they're actually pretty great. You guys may have noticed that overall the biggest change this week on the PTR is the return of Maelstrom. Now, Blizzard stated that in this week's PTR and beta build, several changes have been made to bring the Maelstrom resource back for Elemental Shaman. Many months ago, we had prompted or opted to try not having a special resource on the Shaman class and went forward with the plan to remove Maelstrom and rebuild Fulmination as an ability. It was prior to the whole Legion expansion. Ever since the first alpha builds, we have been watching reactions and listening to how people feel about using the Fulmination buff. Many changes were made to make more and more spells and abilities interact with Fulmination. Any sort of randomness was removed, and we've wound up back in a place that feels almost exactly like Maelstrom. And we discussed this before, where it pretty much felt exactly like the same, except from like maybe a Walmart version that was joked about before, which is fine, but unfortunately it just didn't work out. So only instead of an easy to read resource bar on your unit frame like we have in the default UI, it's a hidden stacking buff on your buff bars, which obviously can be lost pretty easily, especially with how the stacking buffs have been recently in BFA times, and I can only imagine it's probably not going to get that much better going into Shadowlands with the whole borrowed power system that we still have. So after some discussion in the past weeks, we have decided just to revert the changes that replaced Maelstrom with Fulmination. So everything's back to Maelstrom. And they say that after some discussion in the past weeks, that means discussing things with the community. So they've been taking in the community feedback, obviously, and really finding out that it wasn't really much better. But Maelstrom definitely worked better with Elemental than it did with Enhancement. So there still are a few remaining places where Fulmination may be mentioned, such as like Conduits or the Lightning Shield. But those will either be changed to interact with Maelstrom or be redesigned entirely in an upcoming build. So fingers crossed for Lava Shock to be brought back as a conduit. I'm only joking, but that would be really fun. Thank you all for testing and your feedback. Now, this is fantastic, but that we're reverting back to Maelstrom from Fulmination. It's a great change, though it kind of feels bad to waste the time that they spent trying to make Fulmination work. Unfortunately, I mean, like, I definitely have sympathy for Blizzard towards this whole thing, and they tried something and it just didn't work. There are no talent changes though for the new build, but we may see some in future builds when it comes to fleshing out kind of like the change back to Maelstrom, as well as like maybe making things a little bit more synergistic with how the class functions through its talents. Why don't we go over the actual spell changes, like the tooltip changes for this build? Since we're reverting back to Maelstrom, things are going to be rebalanced towards that. So let's get into that. So starting out with Earthshock's pretty massive buff, which pretty much just brings it back to the spell's power scaling of where it was in BFA. So coming from retail to Shadowlands, there's really going to be no change in how hard your Earthshock's going to hit relative to its scaling, other than the stat squish, of course. So Earthshock definitely needed this buff because optimally it was better to use Earthquake at 3 stacks of Fulmination because of the interaction of Earthquake's cast time getting reduced lower than the GCD and its base damage just being higher than Earthshock's and Fulmination's combined. So obviously this was an issue. This definitely makes a good change for us because we're going back into Maelstrom. So, woo. Earthquake's base damage did receive a buff due to the removal of Fulmination along with its scaling with Earthquake. So how it was before was obviously you built up Fulmination stacks, and these stacks reduced the cast time of Earthquake, but also increased its damage up to a instant cast of 5 stacks. And then you can go up to 8 stacks of Fulmination to increase its damage by a total of like 160%. So now with the removal of Fulmination and Earthquake being back on Maelstrom spent, it should, or back on 60 cost Maelstrom to use the spell, it should be around the same damage as a 5-stack Fulmination Earthquake, but still just below where it is right now in its base damage in BFA. Now, Blizzard may have tuned it like this because Earthquake does not have a target cap, and Blizzard doesn't want it possibly to be too powerful in pure AoE and uncapped scenarios to keep it more in line with other classes AoE spells. But we'll end up seeing kind of like there's probably going to be another tuning pass towards Elemental Shaman and our other spells. So we're just going to have to wait and see what's going on here. It's probably not going to stay like this, but we'll see in the future. Alright, so Lava Burst did receive another buff to its base damage in this patch. Now it's a little more than twice the base damage of Lava Burst in BFA, but still consider that we do not have like Igneous Potential in Shadowlands, and that is carrying Lava Burst damage a lot more in BFA. So this buff is probably likely happened because they also buffed Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning, and if either of those spells are tuned or touched, then the domino effect happens to the other spells being tuned as a result of that. So keep that in mind, why we are receiving these buffs. Elemental Blast received a buff to its base damage. The additional change to have the spell spend Maelstrom is an interesting one, though. So this is because it is... Well, it's interesting to say the least because it's never guaranteed that you're going to have 60 Maelstrom ready for the cast when it comes off cooldown. So the fact that it has a cooldown and it costs your resource, like your max cap resource of 60 based off of your spells, we will always want to keep the spell on cooldown due to its optimal uptime of the buffs that we receive from casting it. And we are, again, back to the same issue we faced with the spell that costed Fulmination. So hopefully they change this. Maybe it's just not going to have as much Maelstrom spent, cap. Like maybe not 60, but like 25 or 30 would be a lot more easier for us to keep the spell uptime going based off of its cooldown. But I think 60 Maelstrom is a little too much based off of that change. So hopefully they give us a change in the Maelstrom, or just remove Maelstrom interaction with it at all. That would be fantastic because it didn't have one before. If we're reverting back to Maelstrom now, why is Elemental Blast now costing Maelstrom? It doesn't have like a scaling thing with it. Like, anyway, let's move on to the next part of the of the buffs. Icefury received a huge buff, which has raised some eyebrows. Now, Icefury's now increases Frost Shock's damage by 300% spell power, up from 200%. And this is not as powerful as it was in Legion. Like back in Legion, we had our Frost Shocks dealing 400% spell power, if I recall correctly. So it's not as strong as Legion was, but obviously this is a lot better than where BFA stands for the Icefury. So it makes it an even stronger choice now for heavy movement fights or priority target encounters. And the changes Blizzard is making to go back to Maelstrom has also made the Frost Shocks generate Maelstrom that are empowered by Icefury. So even though right now in the build it may say that it doesn't, it's just a tooltip error, and that tooltip will get fixed in the next build. But currently on the beta they are generating 8 Maelstrom per cast, whereas with Fulmination, if we look at where Icefury was back when Fulmination was still in, the spell felt like a side rotation that didn't really fit or belong in the kit because it didn't have any interaction with it. So it's good that we're going back to Maelstrom. I'm really enjoying playing Icefury on the beta right now because it's doing a crap ton of single target damage, and it feels really nice to play that spell again and have it generate Maelstrom, and a lot of Maelstrom. So obviously, Blizzard has made a change to Surge of Power to include Elemental Blast as an activator spell for the talent. Now, it makes sense because Elemental Blast is now consuming Maelstrom, but this doesn't change the fact that Surge of Power has a very niche scenario where it's going to be useful, like it did back in Eternal Palace with Orgazoa, with Flame Shock spreading and funneling into the boss with all of your Lava Surge procs that you would get. But a talent that only has one, maybe two scenarios where it's going to be useful still means that the talent itself needs to be looked at and possibly changed. So fingers crossed for a possible resurgence of the Surge of Power. See what I did there? Talent, if it gets a little bit of a change or a little bit more attention, maybe even a complete rework. We don't know. There's still a little bit of time for Blizzard to make some changes, so hopefully this one is on their radar. I wanted to talk a little bit about the changes to Echoes of the Great Sundering Legendary to include Elemental Blast as well, like they did with Surge of Power. And it makes sense, obviously, because Elemental Blast continues to have a Maelstrom Spender interaction. Additionally, though, the change back to Maelstrom actually makes Echoes of the Great Sunder an even more balanced legendary choice for Mythic Plus, considering now that we have, while using the legendary, our spending of Maelstrom on Earthshocks into priority targets will not feel like we wasted Maelstrom on our overall damage in cleave scenarios or heavy AoE scenarios. And due to Echoing Shock copying a buffed version of Chain Lightning when using Stormkeeper. Now, Echoing Shock didn't receive any changes, but I figured it was worth mentioning here. So Echoing Shock has a specific interaction with the spells that it copies. It will read your buff bar and see when it's copying the spell that you casted and see what buffs interact with that spell, and it will use those buffs. But it will not spend them. Like, it won't take away charges of Chain Lightning or sorry, not Chain Lightning, but Stormkeeper. When it duplicates the spell, it will copy the spell based off the buffs that you have. So it will overload on every target hit by a Chain Lightning if you casted after Echoing Shock and then used a Chain Lightning that was empowered by Stormkeeper, but still have one stack remaining of Stormkeeper. So now you'll get 3 potential times or casts of Chain Lightning on every target when using Echoing Shock properly with Chain Lightning. So you could put out 2 fully empowered Earthquakes while using the Echoes of the Great Sundering Legendary within just a few globals of each other, with like little to no ramp up. So it kind of, like, the way that you would do it would be like you would cast your Stormkeeper, then Echoing Shock your target, Chain Lightning into an Earth Shock, so you spend the Maelstrom that you just got from the first Chain Lightning, and your Echoing Shock will copy the first Chain Lightning that you have, overload on every target after that, so you just regain all of the Maelstrom back, and then you can immediately put down an Earthquake within like 3 globals, which is like a fully empowered Earthquake within 3 globals. And then you need like maybe 20 Maelstrom in order to continue this. So you could cast 2 Lava Bursts, right? And then Earthshock again, or maybe instead of 2 Lava Bursts, you could cast an Icefury because it gives you 25 Maelstrom. And then you cast Earthshock again, and you still have your second Stormkeeper buff, so you cast Chain Lightning again, gives you all of the Maelstrom that you need to then drop your second empowered Earthquake. So all things considered, this is quite scary when looking at like the possibility of threat issues. So you guys may need to be careful when testing this thing out with your tanks. Let them use a few globals before you pop this on your foes, because it does a lot of burst damage with, like I said, little to no ramp up. So have some fun out there. Just thought I'd mention this in the video since we were talking about the legendary. So Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning both received buffs in this patch, bringing both of their damage even higher than BFA's spell power scaling for these spells. There was also a slight increase to Chain Lightning's overload Maelstrom gains from 2 to 3 Maelstrom per target hit on Chain Lightning's overloads, which is actually quite nice. We don't know if that's actually intended right now, as Lightning Bolt's Maelstrom generation has stayed the same when it comes to its overload. So Lightning Bolt's overload still is at 3, so we don't know if it's intended. We don't know why Lightning Bolt's Maelstrom generation hasn't been touched. We don't know if the overload change on Maelstrom generation for Chain Lightning is a bug or a misstep. So obviously these buffs are still welcomed due to the spells being weaker in the previous build, and it kind of felt crappy casting Chain Lightning. So it also looks like Lightning Bolt still is like near Lava Burst damage. People worry about this, but I'll explain a little bit. So keep in mind though that when Lava Burst hits your target affected by crit or Flame Shock, it automatically crits, and Lava Burst generates 2 more Maelstrom per cast than Lightning Bolt does. So it's obviously still going to be worth casting. And the issue we faced in BFA, where we stopped casting Lava Burst, will only come up again if we reach around like 80+% crit ever again. And this is definitely very unlikely to happen in Shadowlands or any other expansion due to the stat scaling diminishing returns that were implemented recently on beta, and recently as well. There's not recently, but there's no more corruption system. All right, it's gone in Shadowlands. We don't have any crazy out of control stats on mages or Destro locks. Okay, like that's not coming back. Hopefully, please don't bring it back. It broke the game. But anyway, we're going to be using Lava Burst. That's my point. that is my point. So guys, it's understood that these changes to the class reverting back to Maelstrom doesn't fix all of the issues that the class still faces, but we as a community can give further insight and constructive criticism towards those issues now that the changes have fixed many of the issues that Fulmination brought with it. All in all, I think the changes have brought with it have brought the elemental spec actually into the eyes of many other players, and they want to see what the class is capable of with these buffs. So I can see a lot of people copying over or creating new shaman characters and testing out the class on training dummies, which is really cool to see on both the beta and the PTR. A lot of people are trying to test out the class right now, and that definitely helps when we're gaining more insight into the class. We can see what other people think about it that haven't actually picked up the class before. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below about the changes. Again, the link to the class changes that were talked about in the video and the blue posts on the spec that were also provided by the community managers will be in the description down below. So go check them out. Again, if you guys also want to check out my Twitter and Twitch social medias, the links to those will be in the description down below. Drop a follow on those. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Smash that like button. And if you want to see more Elemental Shaman content in the future, keep calm and Maelstrom on. Bye-bye.